Welcome to Premise Podcast. This is your host, Angelos Sophocleous. In this episode, I host AC Grayling, a professor of philosophy at the New College of the Humanities, of which he is also founder and master. We discuss how religious belief evolved and what religion's position is in the modern world. In addition, we emphasize the importance of the Enlightenment in fighting dogma, superstition, and prejudices, and we analyze arguments for and against God's existence. Lastly, we touch on the concept of knowledge in philosophy, and Professor Grayling gives some insightful life advice to young people. Welcome everyone to this episode of Premise Podcast. Today I have the honor to have with me Professor AC Grayling. Professor Grayling is a British philosopher and author who in 2011 founded and became the first master of New College of the Humanities. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and of the Royal Society of Arts, vice president of Humanities UK, and honorary fellow of the National Secular Society. He's the author of about 30 books on philosophy, biography, history of ideas, human rights, and ethics. His main academic interests lie in epistemology, metaphysics, philosophical logic, and philosophy of religion. Professor Grayling obtained his doctorate from the University of Oxford, where he was taught by P.F. Strawson and A.J. Ayer. Today we're going to discuss religion, ethics, morality, and knowledge. Professor Grayling, welcome to Premise Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. So, Professor, as we are going to talk about religion, ethics, morality, and knowledge, I would like to begin with something almost all religions and moral systems share, something that's common in all of them, and that is the golden rule, the principle of treating others as you would wish to be treated. Now, why do you think this is so common in the world's religions and moral systems, and do you think there is anything wrong with it?
Well, firstly, it's important to get the golden rule right. The negative form of it, which says don't do to other people what you don't want them to do to you, is the right way to put it. If you say do to other people what you would like them to do to you, then you fall into the problem that was identified by George Bernard Shaw, who said, if you do to other people what you would like them to do to you, then you have this difficulty that maybe they won't like it because they may not share your tastes. But if you put it negatively, don't do to other people what you don't want them to do to you, then you are in a more reliable situation because there you know that the things that you don't like happening to you, for example, to be lonely or hungry or in fear, that these are the sort of things that you mustn't inflict on other people either. Now, the really interesting thing about this formulation is that it comes from a source, a basis really, in how we understand our obligations towards other people in the way of our behavior, because we're basing it on our personal experience of things that are very common to human beings. Those things I mentioned, the fact that we don't like being hungry or in pain, cold or alone or afraid. These are facts, natural facts, and therefore you see that I'm immediately implying that the is-ought distinction doesn't work. But these are natural facts from which we can deduce something about the constraints on our behavior. And I think the golden rule reflects this. This is why it's a very common feature of almost all human moralities.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the is-ought distinction there. Do you mind expanding on that a bit, like defining it and mentioning its relevance?
Yeah, the is-ought distinction is that you can't get a prescription, a moral injunction from a description of natural facts. This is a claim made by David Hume and agreed to by very many people since then. The idea that any statements which are just descriptive in nature will never entail a moral injunction of some kind. And I disagree with that because I think the point that I've just made, which is a point about just ordinary facts about human beings, ordinary facts about animals, tell us something about our response to them, because we understand, as the Golden Rule suggests, what our own self-appreciation, the phenomenology of these experiences in our own case, tells us something about how we should behave towards others.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the most important formulation of, or I better put it, the correct formulation of the Golden Rule is that don't do to others what you don't want to be done to you. And I think a better formulation would be treat others as they want to be treated. That is, by saying treat others as you want to be treated, is like having yourself as the measure, as the center of your moral judgment. But in having the other as the center of your moral judgment, the other as the measure, then it might...
Well, it's a good point. The negative formulation of the Golden Rule states a very, very minimal condition. Just from your own experience, you know some things that you shouldn't do to other people. Your formulation, do to others what they would like you to do to them, has the virtue of being more positive and active. But on the other hand, it's not clear that everything that other people would like you to do are things that you should do. For example, somebody might like you to give them all your money, or somebody might like you to cheat or steal or lie on their behalf. And these are things that, even though they might please the other person, are not things that you might necessarily want to do. So somewhere between the negative formulation where from your own experience you know there's a kind of bottom line about what not to do, and from your desire to show concern and help and a positive reaching out to other people, there is this sense of what is appropriate and where the fullest extent of your actions towards others might end.
And I think it's clear now how you develop the is-ought distinction, so that we cannot derive a normative statement from descriptive facts. For example, we might say that when you hit someone, they feel pain, and when they feel pain, they cry. These are descriptive statements. Therefore, we make the normative statement that it's wrong to hit someone. And you think that's sufficient, that descriptive statements can give us a moral framework?
Yes, but you have to remember, of course, that you need to enrich the consideration a little bit. I mean, there's always a qualification which says other things being equal. So we know that hitting somebody will cause them pain and distress. But there are some occasions when you might have to hit them in order to help them. For example, to bring them around from a state of unconsciousness, or to shock them out of a state of hysterical paralysis or something. You can imagine those sorts of situations. Or you might be protecting somebody else, person B, by hitting person A because A is bullying person B, let us say. So there will always be circumstances, and those circumstances need to be taken care of by these ceteris paribus clauses. So don't hit other people because it hurts and distresses them, unless there are overriding reasons why you should, and the reasons in question would be such that they would stand as a kind of justification for doing so.
Mm-hmm. And as we mentioned, that the Golden Rule is something common in all religions. Religions themselves seem to be everywhere in the world, as long as there have been civilizations or the modern world, there have been religions or religious moral systems. How can one explain the evolution of religion? How did religion evolve?
I will say this is a very big topic, but the first thing to say about it is that the connection between morals and religion is a very recent one. It's a connection associated really with the young religions of the world, to some extent Judaism, but especially with Christianity and Islam. And these are young religions, of course, because at the furthest extent, maybe 3,000 years in the case of Judaism, 2,000 years, less really 1,500 years in the case of Christianity, and maybe 1300 years in Islam. Now, if you look at religion in the Roman Empire, or if you look at Greek religious beliefs, you notice that they're not associated with morality. They are much more to do with, in the case of the Roman Empire anyway, as you see from the etymology of the word religion, which is religio, religere, which means to bind. It's about social cohesion. In a huge empire, many different ethnicities and languages and traditions and cultures, the worship of the emperor or the worship of Jupiter provided for great public occasions when the society could come together. It was in the mystery cults like Orphism, where some kind of subjective experience, perhaps by taking drugs or getting into a kind of frenzy like the dervishes, the whirling dervishes, would precipitate religious seeming experiences. But these weren't about morality. The connection between a moral way of life and a religious way of life is therefore very recent. If you go back earlier, you find that religions are quite often associated with taboos. So, for example, in Judaism, a lot of the early laws of the Judaic tradition have to do with things you can't eat, people you can't sleep with, things you must say, times of day when you, or times of the week, or times of the month when certain things are forbidden or certain things are required. And these are taboo traditions, not really moral traditions. But now you ask me about how religion originated. And here we have to do a kind of genealogy, like Nietzsche, and do it on the basis of our most rational reconstruction of how it is that our ancestors in early human history could have started to develop certain sorts of beliefs about supernatural agencies in the universe or supernatural entities of some kind. And I think actually the answer is relatively simple. It's this: our early ancestors, in their efforts to try to explain natural phenomena, had only one compelling concept that they could apply, and that was the concept of agency. So I pick up a stone, I throw it into the lake, and it makes a splash. So I've done something. I've changed the course of events in nature. So if I think about the wind, or the change of the seasons, or the thunder, or the growth of plants, it's very natural to impute those events to agency. And I begin to think that everything is full of agents. If you look at early mythologies, they are all about the nymphs and the dryads in the streams and the trees, or about the gods in the sky or under the sea. They're all about agencies. They anthropomorphize these agencies. And if you think about the different mythologies and the emergence of religions, you notice that from everything in nature having some kind of supernatural agency attached to it, these agencies became fewer and fewer. They even moved away from the woods and the streams, as you find them in Greek mythology, for example, to the tops of mountains, top of Mount Olympus. Moses met his God at the top of a mountain in a burning bush. And maybe the fire at the top of the mountain and the smoke that guided the children of Israel in the wandering in the wilderness suggests that one of the gods of ancient Judaism, which at a certain point, as you know, was polytheistic, was a volcano god. But when people got to the top of the mountains, and for very, very many centuries, right up until recent times, mountaintops were regarded as holy places. But when people got there and found that there weren't any gods there, the gods, who, by the way, had diminished in number very considerably from the earliest times, had moved into the sky. Now, the very few gods there are, perhaps one if you're in a monotheism, or if you're a Christian, three persons in one, they're now beyond space and time altogether. So over the history of religion, you've seen a diminishing and a removal of the idea of these supernatural powers, which no longer provide direct explanations for natural phenomena, but a much more general or generic story about who's responsible for the origin of the universe or its existence, and so on. Mm-hmm. And these gods have changed their nature as well. So the gods, the very few or one god that exists now, is almost entirely about morals and about how we behave. Whereas until really recently in human history, just a couple of thousand years ago, the gods had nothing to do with morality, but everything to do with the activities of nature.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps that has to do with the fact that we do have explanations, natural explanations about for things that we didn't have an explanation in the past, and people used to attribute the those events to supernatural intervention. So the
Exactly.
fact that we have explanation of a lot of natural happenings, then religion, as you said, has moved to morality.
Exactly. It's like people who lose their job and they have to retrain for a new career. This is what happened to God.
And the main argument of those who claim that you cannot have morality without religion, or if you are religious, then it's more likely that you're going to also be moral. Well, we see statistically that this is wrong. The more religious a country is or a society is, then the more violent, the more racist, the more xenophobic it gets. But also is the fact that these tend to attribute Western values and the Western moral system to Judeo-Christian values. And that's not particularly true. The Western world, the Western morality, which we all respect and try to promote in the world because it promotes human rights, it promotes a system of morality in which everyone is equal. And this is not found in Judeo-Christian values, so Judeo-Christian values are not the source of Western morality.
No, they're not actually. And the really compelling consideration here is this. If you think about the fact that when Christianity became the dominant outlook of the European mind, so that was by the end of the 4th century of the Common Era and into the 5th century, at that time, the religion needed a lot of extra conceptual input. If you look at the New Testament, it says, in answer to the question, how should I live if I want to get into heaven? It says two kinds of things. It says, be kind to the widows and orphans, love your neighbor, and so on. Now, these are views which are common to all moralities, all good moralities, whether they're religious or not. For example, 200 years before the birth of Jesus, Mo Zi in China, the Maoist in China, talked about loving your fellow man and treating everybody as your brother and your sister. And that was not related to a religious injunction at all. But go back even further to earlier thinking in, let us say, the Buddha, who talked about compassion. Now, again, the Buddha was not a religious figure or a preacher. He didn't say that he got his messages from God or that people get into heaven if they obeyed him. He just said compassion for the suffering of things in the world is the core of our moral being. Okay, so when you look at the New Testament, you see it says things that a lot of other moral theories say, but then it also says certain things which are actually deeply impractical. It says, give away all your money, make no plans, give no thought to tomorrow, don't marry. And it says these things because it believes that the end of time is coming very soon. The Perusia, the Messiah is coming back next week, or perhaps tomorrow, or perhaps next month. So you don't need money, you don't need to make plans, you're not going to have a family. The things of this world are not important. Now, a lot of people tried to live like that. A lot of people went into the desert, the hermits, the desert fathers, and so on. Mm-hmm. But when after several centuries, it was clear that the second coming might take a bit longer, they needed a richer kind of morality to live by. And where did they get it from? They got it from the philosophical tradition, mainly from Stoicism, but from other places as well. Just as they got from Neoplatonism the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. As you know, St. Paul says the saints, that's the people who believe, won't be corrupted in the grave. Your body won't rot in the grave. But when the Emperor Theodosius in 380 CE made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, and the Christians started to convert temples into churches and build their churches, and they went to dig up the martyrs and the saints to bring their bones, or their bodies anyway, to perform miracles in the churches, they found that the bodies of the faithful had rotted, and there were nothing but bones left. And so that seemed to deny what St. Paul said. So they adopted instead the idea of the immortal soul, which had been no part of Judaic thinking or of early Christian thinking, but which, of course, is an important element in Plato's epistemology.
And we can see many beliefs here which can be validly described as illogical or irrational or simply non-divine. We see very well here that how religion evolves as a human creation. And here we can perhaps discuss the importance of the Enlightenment in revealing the human nature of religion, that it's a human creation which its only aim is to fill some gaps in people's minds or to give people some explanations for what people didn't know in certain times in history. So what's the importance of the Enlightenment here?
The great essay by Immanuel Kant called What is Enlightenment gives us our answer here. He said in that essay that the point of enlightenment, and by the way, he didn't think that the 18th century was a time that was enlightened, but he thought that enlightenment was beginning, like the dawn was coming up. He said what enlightenment consists in is people taking responsibility for themselves, people using reason rather than relying on traditions or beliefs or what other people tell them. People standing up really against the alleged authorities. Remember, he said, everywhere I look, I see the policeman say obey, and the taxman say pay, and the preacher say believe. But if you think for yourself, if you use reason, if you test the claims that are made by the absolute monarchs and by the priests and bishops, you will find that it's liberating, that it frees you from the kinds of tyrannies imposed over us by these systems. That was key to the Enlightenment, the idea of daring to know, sapere aude, is the slogan, the motto that Kant put forward. So this idea that the process of enlightenment is a process of applying reason is key to this, because it calls into question all those systems of thought, either in society or in religion, which are not based soundly on the kind of rational considerations that reason privileges. By the way, I think there were many individuals throughout the course of history who took the same kind of view as the philosophers of the Enlightenment did. But for very many centuries, it was dangerous to tell people that you did that, because you could quite easily be executed for being regarded as a heretic and impugning the authority of the church. And one very significant factor about the Enlightenment is that in the Enlightenment, there was a return by religious people to the production of what was called apologetics. Apologetics is the kind of writing where you try to persuade people that a certain belief system has validity. In the very early history of Christianity, the church fathers wrote apologetical literature because there was a very skeptical audience at the time who didn't believe in the miracles and the stories and so on. And so apologetics was necessary. But by the medieval period, apologetics were no longer necessary, because by that time it was a criminal offense not to believe and not to go to church. And as I say, you could be executed for being a heretic. But by the 18th century, at the time of the Enlightenment, that was no longer a resource. The church could no longer coerce belief in that way or make people act as if they believe and say that they believe, no matter what they thought, a bit like North Korea, loving the great leader, you know. But in the 18th century, apologetics returns. And this is where you get books like the one by William Paley, you know, the watchmaker, if you found a watch in the desert, the argument from design, having to use arguments to try to show that there is a deity instead of just using coercive authority.
Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, arguments that theists use to prove God existence, I would like to discuss arguments for and against God's existence. But before doing that, I know you've also written on the importance of the printing press before the Enlightenment and during the Enlightenment. How was the invention of printing important in the Enlightenment and in the advance of science and scientific thinking?
Well, the very, very great importance of it is that people who were opposed to the church and its authority in the period before printing were only really able to address relatively small numbers of people, because getting their opinions out there into the public domain needed either the direct contact with people through preaching, or the relatively limited contact but wider contact that came from copying manuscripts. But when the printing press was invented in the 15th century, immediately it was possible for people's views and for ideas and for reports of what people said to be disseminated very, very widely to very large numbers of people. So there were people who were more or less similar in their attitudes towards the authority of the church as Martin Luther. But Martin Luther lived in the first century of printing, and his views were disseminated extremely widely, and so were the views of those people after him, people like Zwingli and Calvin and others who were part of the great general Protestant movement, the protestation against the authority of the Church of Rome. And so it was printing that triggered the Reformation. And that had an immediate consequence, which was that in the parts of Europe that became Protestant, that revolted against the authority of Rome, in those parts of Europe, the churches were not strong enough to control people and to persecute and put people to death if they disagreed with the teachings of the Protestant pastors. And therefore, there was a great flourishing of independent thought. In the first century of the Reformation, the first 3/4 of a century, in the 16th century, there was a great outburst of interest in magic and astrology and Kabbalah and Hermeticism, a lot of nonsense. But by the beginning of the 17th century, more sensible people had begun to see that there were aspects of this, aspects of alchemy and magic and so on, that could be really indications of something more serious. So, for example, to take from alchemy those things that were interesting for chemistry, to take from magic those things that were interesting for medicine, to take from astrology those things that were interesting for astronomy, and to apply serious methods to the investigation of them. And that was something that was done by Descartes and by Bacon in the early part of the 17th century. That was a very important moment, therefore, in helping the growth of science. Even Copernicus, in the middle of the 16th century, was very nervous about publishing his heliocentric view. Giordano Bruno, who claimed that he was a follower of the Copernican view, was put to death in the year 1700 in Rome because he said so. Galileo, in the 1630s, not 1700, 1600 for Giordano Bruno, right? 1632 for Galileo, was put on trial for supporting the Copernican view. But that was pretty well the last shot that the church had in trying to control the growth of ideas, because far too much had already happened in the Protestant parts of Europe, and it was no longer possible to stem this tide of new investigation of the scientific and the philosophical revolutions of the period. And that had, as I say, trace it back to printing, trace it back to the fact that the ideas that caused the Reformation were able to be disseminated so very widely in Europe.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to also discuss some more recent views on the Enlightenment movement, and that had to do with some 20th century philosophers and also with the postmodernists. For example, the German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer says in his book Truth and Reason, there is one prejudice of the Enlightenment that is essential to it. The fundamental prejudice of the Enlightenment is the prejudice against prejudice itself, which deprives tradition of its power. Now, Gadamer was saying that tradition, history, and culture are important in understanding ourselves, understanding the world we live in. And he thought that tradition, as well as any system such as religion, is a way of understanding the world. And he thought that science was just another way of understanding the world. But it seems that he uses the word prejudice in two different ways here. One as means of understanding, and the other as illogical beliefs. Now, I think it's too far-fetched to describe the Enlightenment as just another means of understanding. It's mostly the means of understanding. It's the means of understanding against prejudices such as superstitions and any illogical beliefs. How would you respond to this statement by Gadamer?
It seems to me a confusion in Gadamer's case between 2 points. One is that, of course, in our ordinary human experience, our social experience, a sense of belonging, a sense of identity, a sense of community with fellows in our culture or in our society rests in part anyway on certain shared traditions, a little bit like if you follow a football team and then you know the history of the football team and you know when it won the cup a few years ago, etc., etc. And these things are kind of important in a way for a sense of loyalty and a sense of bonding. So that's perfectly understandable. But that kind of view is sometimes made the key to a political outlook, and that is where all conservative parties and nationalist parties and xenophobic parties make use of this idea that tradition and belonging, is a kind of trumping factor in what's politically important or socially important. But it is certainly not an epistemology. It's certainly not a way. It's possible to understand a people by understanding their traditions, but it's not a way of understanding the world by looking at how people traditionally understand the world. I think they mistake the conflation there is between those instruments of reason and of inquiry, the use of the scientific method, for example, which have told us so very much about the nature of the material world, and to a significant extent have given us some control over aspects of it, and which have enabled us to develop technologies of communication and travel and medication and so on, which have been very transformative in human life. They provide an enormous amount of proof, really, that that way of thinking, that kind of scientific methodology, that kind of epistemology is very, very fruitful. I often say to people, try to heat and light your house by prayer, or try to light and heat your house by connecting it to the electricity supply and see which one works better. No, there's a test there, okay? So if you rely on the religious or cultural traditions as the lens through which you see the world, it's inevitably going to be highly relative, highly parochial, and highly misleading, because our traditions come to us from times when we didn't really understand things as well as we do now.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you be able to give us a brief outline of the teleological, ontological, cosmological arguments for God's existence and how the atheist might provide a response to them?
Okay, well, the teleological argument says that everything that exists displays the appearance of design, of purpose, that it was especially made to do what it does. So the heart was designed to pump blood, or the eye was designed to see. Everything you look at in nature exhibits design. So that's the teleological argument, from telos, the end or aim, objective of something. Cosmological argument says everything that happens in the world happens because it is caused to happen. It's the effect of an earlier cause. But that earlier cause is itself the effect of an even earlier cause. And so the causal chain runs back and back. Now, either it runs back and back ad infinitum, or there must be a first cause, a cause which either wasn't caused or causes itself. So there has to be a first cause. So the teleological argument says there must be a designer. Cosmological argument says there must be a first cause. And then, rather differently, there is the ontological argument. And this argument says that you can prove the existence of God just from the very concept of God. So in Descartes' version of it, he says, we can conceive of a being which is the most perfect being in the universe. But a most perfect being which actually exists, and not just as a concept, is more perfect than one that just exists as a concept. Therefore, the most perfect being exists. And he identifies this with God. That's a version of an argument that was devised by others, but one of the principal earlier devisers was a man called Anselm. So let's look at these arguments. Okay, the design argument, if it were really true that everything exhibits unmistakable evidence of design, would at most entail that there is a designer. It doesn't follow that the designer is the god of any traditional religion or is even a god. It just might be an extremely clever Martian or some kind of a being. And maybe that being who did all the designing has since ceased to exist or gone away. So that would be the very best that you could hope from an argument from design teleological argument if the argument itself stands up. But unfortunately, it doesn't. Because firstly, you can explain the appearance of design very simply. You can have a very, very simple computer program which just has a few elements and a few simple operations on them, and that system will produce things of tremendous complexity and adaptability. This is something that Richard Dawkins has shown. I think he has it on his website. He shows you how you can replicate this kind of system. But also, there are many things in nature and in the universe which are very badly designed, and would suggest that if there were a designer, quite often the designer was rather incompetent or didn't really do the best job that's possible. It's also clear in nature that some things, like for example the eye, have been evolved in a number of different ways. If I remember correctly, there are 17 different ways that eyes have evolved in the course of nature in different sorts of animate beings. So the argument of design fails, and its failure is significant because one of the main opponents of scientific Darwinian evolution, the so-called intelligent design theory, and a great deal of money is put behind this, and big efforts are made in the United States to introduce intelligent design theory into schools as a direct competitor to biological evolution. So it's important that the fallacies in the argument ought to be understood. The cosmological argument, which says that there must be a first cause, well, supposing it to be true that the idea of a causal series ad infinitum doesn't make sense. Well, if there were something that caused the universe to come into existence and to be as it is now, there's no reason why it can't be the universe itself which is its own cause. But that's exactly what Big Bang cosmology suggests, that from a quantum singularity you get to the evolution of a universe which can be traced back through the course of its evolution to that singularity. So there, if there has to be a first cause, you could nominate the universe as its own cause. But it's not clear to me that the way we human beings think, so for us, we impose systems of causal explanation onto phenomena. But in elementary particle physics now, the concept of cause doesn't have a place. The way that phenomena are described at the quantum level is not in terms of the familiar causal apparatus that we apply in giving explanations of the sort of macroscopic world that we're familiar with. So there are different conceptual models that we could use to understand phenomena. And this one, the one that we use psychologically, the cosmological one, might not be the definitive one. Therefore, the cosmological argument falls into question. The ontological argument was very powerfully dealt with by Kant, whom we've already mentioned, who pointed the following out, that if you think that existence is a property, of things. So in the argument, it says existence is one of the perfections, and therefore a most perfect being must necessarily exist because existence is a perfection. Then you are making a very serious mistake, which you can see as follows. Supposing I say that the table that I'm sitting at is brown, is rectangular, and has 4 legs, and it exists. Now, what I can do is I can paint it a different color, and I can take away one of the legs, and I can even perhaps get a chainsaw and make it less rectangular, but it still exists. What I can't do is take away its existence, and it would still be rectangular and brown and have 4 legs. This looks, therefore, as if existence is something things must have in order to have any properties at all. And existence cannot simply be one of the properties among those properties. Therefore, the argument fails on that ground, because it makes existence a property. But there are other reasons also. It could be true that there is a being in the universe which is the most perfect being. But in order to be the most perfect being, it only has to be less imperfect than all the other beings. So you or I might be the most perfect being in the universe, however imperfect we are. It's just that everything else might be more imperfect. So that would make the argument look a little less appealing. And also, you can effect a kind of reductio on the argument by pointing out that if the argument were valid on its own terms, then you could use it to prove that it is impossible, in the logical sense of impossible, for there to be a devil, as follows. You say there is a least perfect being in the universe. Now, a least perfect being which doesn't exist is even less perfect one that does. Therefore, the least perfect being in the universe doesn't exist. And that is a kind of reductio.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So there seems to be no convincing argument for God's existence. But would you promote a world without religion? Do you see any sociological, historical, even mythological value to religion? Of course, we want a world without superstitions, without all this violence that stems from religion. But how would you imagine a world without religion?
Personally, I think it would be a happier and more peaceful world for the following reason, that all the great art and music and architecture which is associated with religion is also, of course, produced by people who aren't religious and also produced for non-religious reasons. So the creativity and the enjoyment of beauty, the love of music, which is in human beings, all that would remain. So by taking the religious sponsors away, of course, in the medieval period, the Renaissance time, church was very rich. It commissioned a great deal of art, and so people associate the art with the church. But the art will still exist. More importantly, however, is the fact that a non-religious ethical outlook, humanism, would be one that we would encourage people to adopt. Now, humanism is the view that the way we relate to other people and the way we treat them should be premised on our most generous, most sympathetic understanding of what it is to be human, of human nature and the human condition. Of course, we have to have standards, we have to have lines, we can't tolerate absolutely everything. We cannot, for example, tolerate cruelty and injustice and greed and selfishness. But we are social animals, we human beings. And if we promote all those aspects of ourselves where we express our comradeship, our friendship for others, if we express and act upon the fact that we need to give love and to be loved in intimate relationships, if we understand these things about our human existence and the human conditions of our existence, then we can have an ethics which is highly tolerant, highly fraternal, which is based just on the values of things in this life, between the cradle and the grave, nothing to do with an afterlife, nothing to do with pleasing a deity, and which is motivated by our fellow feeling, by our sense of what, as people, as humans, we owe one another, given our understanding this goes back to the points that we were making very much earlier about collapsing the fact-value distinction, the is-ought distinction, because our sympathetic understanding of things that human beings are and do and need and experience, that teaches us a very, very great deal about how to make life for all of us good and better. If you think about religious moralities, you notice something really rather unpleasant about them, and that is that they are premised on a command, and the command is enforced by promises and by threats. If you obey the command, you receive a promise of felicity, of bliss in an afterlife. If you disobey the command, and the very concept of sin in religion, by the way, means disobedience. If you disobey the command, you're going to be punished in one way or another, either the old-fashioned ideas of burning in hell, or the modern ideas of being rejected by the deity in the afterlife and having to suffer eternal loneliness or something. Whatever those ideas are, this kind of view about the basis of morality is a fallacy. It's the logical fallacy called the argument to force, argumentum ad baculum, which means do what I say, otherwise I'll beat you up. It's effectively what it comes down to. The humanist view, on the other hand, starts from the idea that we human beings, we have great capacities and potentials for good, but also for suffering, for failing, for acting out our flaws and faults. And therefore we must try to accommodate these things so that we can live together in communities that have a chance of flourishing. The flourishing life, the good life, the life of good relationships, that is the human life. And the humanist outlook is one that tries to promote that without any appeal to the existence of gods or to any kind of religious teachings. And by the way, humanism also contains a great respect for the natural world and for other forms of life, partly because we have to pass on the world to our children and grandchildren and future generations, and we have to be responsible to them and look after a world that we're going to bequeath to them, but also because of the intrinsic value of nature. Because a dog, a cat, a chicken, a bird can suffer, can be afraid, or can enjoy its life, we have the right kind of responses to those facts in them also. So I would say that without religion, you could have humanism, and you could have a focus on the right target, which is life here in the world during the period between birth and death.
Further, I would like your thoughts on this. So, it seems to me that the mere fact that there are so many religions in the world, and especially so many denominations of certain religious groups, this fact on its own shows that the method religions use to discover truths about the world fails. In science, if it was the case that there were thousands of different theories of evolution or thousands of different theories of gravity, then this would say something about science. It would say that perhaps science is not the right way to discover things about the world. Yeah. But the fact that biologists may disagree on some facts about evolution, but there are not thousands which fundamentally disagree with each other, this must say something.
I agree with you. I think that's a very good point. A lot of people say, of course, that all the different religions, different views of deity are just culturally alternative ways of focusing on the same truth. But when you dig into it a little bit, you find that actually the basis, the theological conceptions that underlie these different religions do have some very important differences in them. One thing is, I don't know whether in your background there might be a tradition of Orthodox Christianity. As you know, the great schism between the Western and Eastern churches, the Roman and the Orthodox churches, turned on the word "and," having to do with whether the Holy Ghost proceeds from the Father and the Son, or just from the Father. Now, this is an indication of the fact that when you dig down into theologies, you find incredibly trivial seeming but with huge consequences for what it is people believe and do. And this suggests that if you were to dig even further, then it might be that insofar as there are any clear conceptions of deity in any of the religious traditions, and this is a big problem, as you know, because when you argue with religious people, eventually you hear them saying, but that's not what I mean by God. Or they might say, God is infinite and perfect and we can't really understand him. He's ineffable, so there's nothing we can say about him. Well, of course, if that's the end product, then why are we having the discussion at all? But just before you get to that point, the point where there's nothing more to discuss, nothing more that you can possibly discuss, you do find these very deep differences. And I think that's a reinforcement of the point that you've made, that religion comes in so many different varieties, so many different alternatives, so many different ways of conceiving the putative realities in question, that it provides a kind of self-refutation of it.
Mm-hmm. And before closing, I would like to briefly touch on something else that you are working on the concept of knowledge in philosophy. So, since Plato, the understanding of knowledge was that knowledge is justified through belief, belief that we have, which must be truth, must correspond to some state of affairs in the world, and that we must also be justified in believing it. Now, in 1963, Edmund Gettier wrote this paper, Is Justified Through Belief Knowledge, in which he challenged the tripartite theory of knowledge by providing some counterexamples in which one might have justified true belief but couldn't say that they have knowledge. Would you mind expanding on what Gettier's point was, and what do you think is the problem with the tripartite theory of knowledge? Do we need a fourth component, as some philosophers argued, or do we need a better understanding of justification?
Well, you've explained the Gettier claim very well. Gettier says, if you take the view that knowledge is a justified belief which is true, and this is something, as you pointed out, goes all the way back to Plato, then you have this problem that sometimes you can believe something and your belief may be very powerfully justified. You may have all the evidence that you think is relevant and so on. And it even may be true, but it happens that the justification doesn't connect in the right kind of way with the truth. And therefore, this seems to be a case where you cannot claim to know, even though you have a justified belief which happens to be true. So what philosophers have done in the theory of knowledge after that is to try to find ways of strengthening the justification clause or adding further clauses, like, for example, the fact that your belief tracks the truth, is connected to the truth in certain ways. Perhaps there are causal connections between your belief and the truth, which are such that they provide that additional guarantee that will really turn your justification for holding that belief, which happens to be true, into a case of knowledge. So there are a number of different such efforts made. My own view is that the discussion, in fact, is misdirected, really, for the following reason. I think that there are concepts of knowledge and of truth which apply in a very straightforward way in formal contexts, in mathematics and in logic. But I take the view that the concept of truth is not a univocal concept. So what we mean by the predicate is true in the formal case is different from what we mean by the predicate is true in the contingent case, where we're talking about the external world, about what's happening in nature around us. And it's different again from what we mean when we are making moral judgments or moral claims. In other words, the truth predicate is true is in fact a placeholder of a rather general kind for much more specific and particular predicates, which are defined by the discourse in question. So just for examples, which of course would be very controversial, in mathematics, maybe is true means is provable. In the contingent case, maybe is true really means is verifiable. And the moral case is true may mean something like is desirable, or I don't know, is emotionally pleasing, or whatever. So there are lots of different candidates for these more specific predicates, and we know about them because, of course, in those different domains of debate, we've seen these alternatives. In the contingent case, which is the really interesting one, so in the case of the world around us, I want to argue that the concepts of knowledge and truth serve as ideals of inquiry. We want to get knowledge, and we want to be able to acquire true beliefs about the world. And therefore, if we use very, very responsible methods of inquiry, and if we are well disciplined in our reasoning, we may be able to approach knowledge or truth. But if you were to ask a physicist, let's say a particle physicist, whether he knows that something about the nature of quarks or superstrings or something, but whether this is knowledge which can never be defeated by any future evidence or better experimentation, he or she will say, no, we can't claim to know. What we can say is that we have very powerfully supported theories which we can apply with great success. But to claim that they are absolutely true and that we know them and nothing's ever going to change that would be to go too far. And that is an example of how these things are really ideals of inquiry that we're trying to converge on, but we haven't got there yet. And instead of thinking about knowledge and truth, we should think about rationality. We should think about what counts as a rational belief to hold. This, by the way, is very important for the case of thinking about religious claims as well. Think about the word rationality. First part of that word is the word ratio. Ratio means proportion. A rational belief is one for which you have proportionally strong evidence. The more firmly you believe something, the more you regard it as likely to be true, the more rational, that is, the more proportionally based it is on good arguments and good evidence. Give an example. If you looked out of the window and you saw it's about to rain, and you thought to yourself, well, shall I take an umbrella or not? And then you thought, oh, but I've been reading David Hume, so I know that induction is unreliable. Maybe even though I've got wet every time I've been in the rain up until now, maybe the next time I'm in the rain, I won't get wet. So I won't take an umbrella. Now, your neighbors would think that you're a fool if you do that, if you think like that, because that is irrational. It's not rational because you're not basing your actions, your judgment in the case, on the evidence that you have to date. So rationality, a rational belief, is rational to think something, rational to act on a certain basis, is what, in fact, we mainly base our believing and acting on. And we use the terms knowledge and truth in a very colloquial way to talk about those things that we believe and those things that we are confident about claiming, to describe how much value we attach to them. But if we're being strict and literal and philosophical about this, we have to recognize that maybe in the contingent case, we don't know anything and we never come across the truth, but we're trying to get knowledge and we're trying to find out the truth. And what we have in its place is something very powerful, which is rational judgment.
And closing, this is a general question, but I'm sure you're someone who has something of value and of importance to say. What life advice would you give to people and young people?
I would encourage anybody to take the step. Maybe it might seem like a risky one, but to take the step of really trying to live according to what you would most want to do and to be. Instead of living other people's ideas of what a good and a safe, conventional life is, if you have a clear view of things that you could really be passionate about and would really like to be engaged with, you should go for it. Even if after a few years you decide that it was a mistake and you come back to a more conventional way of life, whatever, it doesn't matter because nothing is ever wasted. No experience that you gain will ever be for no purpose. So to live according to one's heart's desire, to follow one's deepest desires. That is the thing, I think, which I would like to advise people to do, or suggest to people to do, however dramatic it might seem or risky it might seem. But in the end, it's what gives people the greatest satisfaction, to be doing the things that they really want to do and loving what they do. There's a Chinese saying that I often quote to people. It was a Chinese poet who said, "I leap from my bed every morning and hasten swift as a thirsty cat to my work, because I love it so." Well, if each one of us lived like that, if we leapt out of bed every morning because we're doing the things that we really want to do and really believe in, then we would be living a life that really felt full of meaning for us.
Professor Grayling, it's been an honor having you in the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you so much, Angelos.
Thank you very much. You have just listened to Premise Podcast. Subscribe to Premise Podcast on YouTube and make sure to follow the podcast on Twitter and Facebook. The podcast is also available on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Soundcloud, Stitcher, and Spotify. Please consider supporting Premise Podcast on Patreon to help bring philosophy to the public. See you next week. Thanks for listening.